So I would like to take this opportunity to welcome the entire ANST community to this webinar series on professional development and leadership in neuropsychology. I would like to welcome our speaker today, Dr. MacDonald. Dr. MacDonald is the co-director of Inclusive Excellence and a clinical neuropsychologist in the section of psychology at Texas Children's Hospital and an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at Baylor College of Medicine. She received her undergraduate degree at Harvard University and her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Denver with specialties in neuropsychology, cross-cultural awareness, and statistics. Dr. MacDonald completed her internship and postdoctoral training in clinical neuropsychology at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center, where she stayed on as faculty. During her time at the University of New Mexico, she founded the Multicultural Excellence in Neuropsychology Training and Evaluation program, a center dedicated to providing clinical training, research, and service delivery to linguistic minorities. At Texas Children's Hospital, she is currently developing and implementing an inclusive excellence program in the section of psychology. She serves on several national and regional boards and initiatives focused on fostering mentorship and strengthening the student pipeline. We'd like to take this opportunity, the entire ANST community, to welcome Dr. MacDonald and to thank her for participating in this very important webinar series on professional development and leadership.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and welcome. I am thrilled to be one of the panelists for this series and really share with the ANST community. In different leadership capacities, I've actually been able to work with different members of the ANST community as well as promote our events and partner with the ANST community as well. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And so we thought we could just start this webinar series and start this webinar with first kind of asking a little bit about kind of what are some leadership and advocacy roles that you have had related to neuropsychology and even more broadly, and what specifically drew you to those specific positions?
Yeah. So I think it really goes back to being in graduate school. So in graduate school, I joined the Multicultural Journal Club, I remember. And we really talked about, diversity, inclusion, equity, and really wanting to make a change within our department in terms of recruitment, what we were looking in courses, and we had a champion, right? We had someone in the faculty that really wanted that as well. So it drew us to develop a strategic plan, what we wanted, to do a needs assessment, and really the opportunity of looking at all the levels of leadership and to make programmatic and systematic changes. And I've taken that with me where I'm currently still doing it at Texas Children's, right? So it's a set of tools from graduate school that's really followed and gave me a passion and commitment for the types of organizations that I've joined. So I think reflecting on all the leadership positions and the very thoughtful questions that the ANST members and the committee put together really made me reflect that there is a common thread of all the organizations that I've joined. So, one was at University of Denver and working in the Diversity Summit and presenting there and working within the department and really promoting representation and serving on the diversity committee for admissions. So that became my passion. That became what I wanted to do and really bring representation and strengthening the student pipeline. And I'm Latina, I'm from Guatemala, and I've been in the United States for 20 years. So for me, it's really the commitment of serving our families and then serving our students and really not having neuropsychology and cultural neuropsychology, but it being neuropsychology, especially with our demographic landscape changing and really being representative of all voices. So that been, I joined the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society, and I served as the student representative, as well as the secretary. And within that, I think I'm very thankful for the committee. They asked if I could co-chair the conference. I think it was 2019. It feels like so long ago, but yet so close. And we partner up with INS, and that was another opportunity of, now I was co-chairing the program of the program of a conference, and having a co-chair and sharing that leadership, which is, now in my possession at Texas Children's, I also have a co-chair. So it's taught me a lot of good communication and integrity, and how much growth and I think it's growth and movement can be done when the leadership is shared, right? So for me, I think in all the different positions, there's been representation and wanting to have all voices heard and part of the decision making. So that's been my journey so far. And I continue to learn every day and get different perspectives. And I think there's so much richness in that diversity of thought and representation when you have everybody at a board, in students, in faculty, in a classroom. So that's very much what I focus my leadership on.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and the different roles that you've played and continue to play in leadership and advocacy. And now I will open it up to kind of the ANST community's questions. And so we'll start with our first question.
Hi. So one question that a lot of trainees have is that when they're first considering joining a neuropsychology organization, what do you think are some factors that they should consider when they're thinking about joining these organizations in leadership positions for student rep positions?
Absolutely. So, I think you'll hear me say it several times throughout the questions, because I think it weaved into the questions that were sent. But I think one of the big ones is mentorship, and looking at, talking with other students that have been in similar leadership positions, and how much mentorship that was offered within the leadership and the board or the committee, right? I think there's a uniqueness of being a student and being able to learn not only from our peers, but from other leaders within a committee or a board. I look at the diversity and representation of the board, in terms of females, in terms of culture, in terms of race, ethnicity, language, ability, across the scope of like what we defined as diversity, and that it's inclusive, right? Looking at if it aligns with your interests and passions. I think when you write an interest or a statement, or you write the statement that you're going to put for voting, I think your passion really has to be clearly communicated and why you're interested in this. So really looking at what drives you, right? We all as students have different niches or things that interest us. If it's epilepsy and working in the special interest group in epilepsy for INS, or if it's Alzheimer's and doing the Alzheimer's Association, or is it diversity, inclusion, and there's the Asian Neuropsychological Association or the Hispanic Neuropsychological Association, right? So there's what drives you and what's your passion, because that's going to make you accountable and to have more commitment to what your time, right? Like our time is precious. So like we have to be intentional in what we wanted to commit, and it comes across in your statement, right? Because you have goals, you have a vision and what you want as a student, and the students are the leaders, they're the future of our organizations. So it's really driving that. And then I often have time, I've had several emails in the last couple months of students reaching out on how to become involved. And some, I've offered, well, you could become involved in this or this, and give lots of options. And I really respect students that come back and say, okay, what's the time commitment? What are going to be my responsibilities? Because you don't want to join and do service, right? Because that's what we're doing. It's leadership and service within our organization. You don't want to be overcommitted, right? And that then you can't deliver. And when they ask you to do something, it's sort of at the back of the list, and they're like trying to get you to do it, right? So like you want to be able to do it well, because then that builds your name, your representation within the community of, you know, so-and-so gets things done, like their leadership, and they're accountable, right? Like that's a really important piece, an aspect of leadership, right?
I think you make a really good point about our time and how it's voluntary. Like these positions are very voluntary. You definitely have to be passionate about these positions and being part of these organizations. So I appreciate you saying that. And like, that's really the drive for joining these organizations and being in leadership positions as well.
I think it was Dr. Paula Sheen. I was at a Women in Neuropsychology event, and we were talking about surveys, and I was like, well, I'm like involved in this and I'm doing this, and she's like, wait, slow down, like choose one. Like I can see that there's, you know, do one thing. And I think that was the same thing for leadership. For example, in research, there was Kathy Holland was speaking in this event as well, and Dr. Holland, you know, was the editor for JINS, and you know, amazing research track record. And, you know, it's like, be that reviewer that gets it done, that gets it quickly, that you're relied on. And then you can sort of, then that leadership within the journal keeps going up, right? They'll ask you to do other things because you are dependable, accountable. So the time commitment is very important.
One of the things that the ANST community was curious about is, what experiences in your training have you felt best prepared you for a leadership position in the field?
Okay. That's a really good question. It really made me think. And, you know, I wanted, you know, you are in leadership positions as well right now. And I wanted to get your perspective of, you know, what are experiences that currently in graduate schools, because I'm a little bit out, right? Like I finished my graduate school, I got to say my age and how long ago, but what experiences are right now really fostering in your institution's leadership?
So I think a big one has been really attending conferences. I think that networking has definitely been a fundamental and been instrumental in kind of getting involved in leadership positions, just seeing all the other members that are involved and seeing all the other organizations. And like you identified prior, it's all about passion. And so there is more than enough organizations to be a part of. And it's really, for me, has really been attending conferences, finding out what's out there, and really, you know, asking myself, what am I most passionate about? What am I most, you know, what is the thing that's going to really drive me to you know, put 110%? And then using that and searching out those opportunities.
Yeah.
I would
How
say,
are you, Jasmine? Mm-hmm.
I would say for me, something that's been really helpful for me is actually working on committees in my grad program, or the department. So I know we're talking about national organizations, but definitely starting out in your department, in your graduate program is definitely important. Joining diversity committees if your department has that, faculty meetings, colloquium committees, admissions committees. So I think I was on all of those at some point in my graduate career, just because I was very adamant about learning the skills to be a leader and getting that experience. And I was very upfront with that with my advisor. So joining these committees, being around other students and other faculty members has been really helpful for me to actually, when I do join these national committees, it's been helpful to have that foundation for me.
I think you guys, both of you touched on really two like really important lessons, right? I think volunteering within your department, really, you start small, and especially, you know, if you had asked me or told me when I was in graduate school, oh, you're going to be doing, you know, panels and really speaking about leadership and networking, I was terrified of networking and like going to conferences, and it was very much my research. I'm going to stand by my poster. So I really like Moshe's perspective of conferences being not just where research is shared, but a community. And I joined the Hispanic I had never heard of the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society until I was, I think, towards the end of my first year of fellowship. And, you know, I had one of my advisors, my supervisors, go to the conference that happened in Austin. And he's like, I think you should join. I think like you should join. And, you know, I was like, okay, like this is, and it opened so many opportunities. So I wish it would have been in graduate school and not in my fellowship, right? Like I was towards the end of my training, but opening such an amazing community and finding that like, oh, that like, and there's, as Marsha was saying, there's so many different groups and committees, like you really can find your point. But I think the other point that Jasmine is saying is a lot of my leadership and things started of being involved in the department, right? Because the stakes weren't as high and it was an opportunity to learn from my peers, from faculty, joined others within the university. And there's so much to learn from our peers, from our colleagues. So I think one experience was putting on my listening and observation, right? We're clinical psychologists at heart. And really listening to what was being said in committees, were people being receptive to everybody's voice, observing different leadership styles and what I gravitated and what I wanted to be. Identifying, as Jasmine said, like being very sponsors and mentors, right? Like what is, and being very clear about your goals with your advisor. Like I want leadership position. I wasn't as clear at the beginning of graduate school to do it, but then towards fellowship and internship and being in New Mexico and seeing the need that for working with culturally and linguistically diverse families really sparked a leadership sort of like gene of like, okay, I need to get on this and do more. And then I think it goes back to that time commitment is learning time management, because it is, you know, I feel like graduate school is sort of like that rubber band of they like stretch it a little bit more every time, right? And it continues to do so even postgraduate school. And learning your time management so that you can be both effective in your research, your work, your clinical work, your education, and then having that community and leadership aspect, which is easier said than done. Let me tell you, it's been years.
So one other question that a lot of trainees have is, for you, since you've been on a lot of committees, when you're evaluating potential student representatives, what sort of experiences and qualities are you looking for in applicants?
Okay. Well, it's funny because I've recently reviewed some applications for some and looking, so it was fresh in my mind of like what I wanted to see. And I think it goes back to the things that we've already spoken about, right? Like that clear vision and goals in your statement. You know, I read a lot of statements or see the statements on websites when you're voting, right? And passion really comes through in some where there's a lot of conviction in why you want to join. And I gravitate towards that, right? You know, right now I'm reviewing for like national leadership positions, and having what Jasmine was saying, leadership in prior within your department, there's a commitment for it, right? Like there is, so I think becoming involved in your department and listing those activities of service, then it shows that you've been volunteering, that you're accountable, that this is not coming out of left field and now I want to come into the national stage and do other things, right? Like you've been building upon. Even if it's regional, right? There's, you know, Colorado has a neuropsychological society, right? There's the New York one that is very active. There's the CPA, the California. So different, even just thinking state, and then within your department. So looking at that, I think fit, and really, I think those are the big ones. I think, a clear vision really comes through. And, you know, we're looking at that clear passion and typos. That's the other one where you really, I think you show a lot in your interest. So that's the other part, really having all the statements that I've written have been vetted by advisors, by people within the same, not the same organization because there's a conflict of interest, but by mentors or peers of, okay, does this come up? How does this come across? Like, what am I missing? What are the language that I should be using, and being open to that growth as well.
I think I want to piggyback off what you said. So something that's been useful for me as I've been applying is actually having other people in my program or department who've applied. So looking at their applications as well, and looking at their cover letters or letters of interest. So if you have that available, I would definitely utilize that as well.
Yeah, and I share mine as well. Like, I've had students like, can you share like what, because sometimes it's the first time that you're doing this and it's scary, right? That's the part where I'm like, take a chance. Don't be scared. Like, it is scary, but and it is anxiety of like putting yourself out there. But I think, I was speaking to my female colleagues and my people of color, like we tend to not go for these things, right? There is a fear. So I really encourage to reaching out for mentors and to reach out and to take a chance. Because then that's how we increase representation in leadership positions as well as committees.
So one of the things that we often hear from ANST members is the concern that they feel like they don't possess the necessary competencies to be a good leader in the field. Okay. What would be kind of your advice to those individuals that are saying that they don't possess the necessary competencies to be a good leader in the field? And what skills related would you recommend that they begin to develop while they're still in their training, early stages of their training, to kind of best prepare themselves for an eventual leadership position in the field?
Okay. So I think that, like, when I read that question, I was like, okay, good leader. And I have it like, what do you think makes a good leader? Right. That came to mind for me in looking at, okay, good leader. Like, I think teamwork was a big one. But right now, my intention and really being intentional in what I'm doing is bringing representation of voices. So that's been in hearing that, right? And sometimes there might be an individual in the group that doesn't want to speak up in a group setting, but then circling back and getting their perspective in things, right? So being able to identify that. So a good communicator, not just in communicating a clear message, as much as I was saying, right? Like, you need to have a plan and a vision of what you want. And I think where I did the most growth on this was putting together the conference, right? Having a co-chair that I had to communicate, but I think there was all these goals where there was an SOP, and I was like, what is an SOP? And it's really like a strategic plan of how things are gonna get done. And there was so much work behind the scenes before we brought everybody in to put together that plan of how, we're going to have these committees, and let's put together committees and be thoughtful on who's going to guide those committees, and how many members and what are the responsibilities of that committee, right? So giving clear instruction of, okay, this is what you are responsible for. Here's the timeline of how this needs to be accomplished, right? And then it was the same thing when I transitioned from secretary, like from student representative to getting a secretary, to being secretary of an organization. I was like, what are my responsibilities? And he's like, here is all the responsibilities you have on like a month to month base, like what you should be doing, right? So then you have a structure, right? So you're not reinventing the wheel. And I think that's something to think about when it's a good leader. It's like, you're not inventing what leadership is. So there's not to put yourself so much pressure of like, what is a good leader? A good leader, and I'm a learning leader. It's one that learns and grows and can do better each day, right? And there's like integrity. You have to have integrity, and that comes with your mission, right? Like, if you have integrity, I have here the quote, and I wanted to share it. It was Dr. Pamela Keenan said that the best career advice I ever received was to lead on my own life before I could effectively lead others. A good friend suggested that I clarify my values, adhere to them without exception, see and accept myself realistically, and be accountable to myself. right? So if you're working on what is your vision, being reliable, being accountable to yourself, right? Like setting goals and achieving them, then you can set goals for others and be encouraging and consistent and approachable and really fostering that in others, right? Because I do think that a good leader, as Jasmine says, is really identifying the talents of others, right? And being a sponsor and really highlighting and elevating everybody in the team. Everybody has a voice, everybody is represented, everybody has good ideas, and recognizing that takes off the pressure of like, I have to lead, right? Like I have to, I'm like, no, you're not doing this alone. And I think that's been so reassuring, having a co-chair or a co-director, even organizations where you're the president, you have an immediate and a past president, right? Because there's so much wisdom shared. You're not thrown into a vacuum and now all of a sudden I have to lead. And I'm like, no, there's so much history and archival knowledge as well as growth and innovation, right? So that's the other part of flexibility. I think as neuropsychologists, we sometimes like this is how it works and this is what we like, right? And sometimes, right, like teleneuropsychology has really pushed us to go beyond and what are we comfortable with, and doing interviews online and, you know, thinking beyond what other just testing can we do as neuropsychologists, right? So I think the innovation and growth, that's the other one, right? Like being open-minded and to experience, right? So those are, for me, as a learning leader, is sometimes the ability to deal with ambiguity, which I like things to be concrete, right? So sometimes there's, and I think that is trusting others, right? If there's integrity and there's confidence and there's humility, you're gonna trust others to do their part, right? And deal that you can't control and you can't do everything for everybody. You have to delegate. That's the other part, right? You have to delegate and engage and really foster work in others. There's, you know, it goes back to project management, like time management, right? Like that's like what Moshe was saying, like having a project and really setting out. So even, you know, having a vision, but also how it's going to get attained. So I think that goes back to the strategic plan and SOPs. And I've learned so much from being in other organizations where I'm like, what's our strategic, like, let's not just follow Forrest, right? Like, what is our goal? What is our vision? And I think if we do that for ourselves, right? What is my goal and what is my development as a neuropsychologist, and what are the stepping stones that are going to get me there? And that is in leadership. What do I want to envision, right? So it starts within and then trying to grow. But, you know, one thing I think that goes back, and I wanted to finish this with this, was the good leader part, right? Like it's the confidence. Sometimes of not having that confidence of I'm afraid. And, you know, each new leadership position has been scary. And sometimes I'm like, you know, I go into it and they're like, well, you're the expert in the room. And I'm like, I'm the expert. I'm like, I have my mentors that I see as experts. And now you're telling me that and from one of my mentors was, you own that. You are the expert in the room. You are the one that has that passion and that vision, and you're there to represent an aspect in that teamwork. And you have to assure others that that is going to be the case, right? Because the moment that you're like, well, but I don't know, then your leadership sort of takes back, right? Like it's, yes, these are the things, but I'm open to hearing other ideas and I want us to grow as a team. So there's both that, right? Welcoming that feedback, but also confidence. And sometimes, as we say, you fake it till you make it, but you are there. And then sometimes you leave that room and you're like, oh goodness. But no, and having that confidence in yourself, right? So it goes back to Jasmine of the point of starting in small committees and gaining that confidence, right? It doesn't come all of a sudden, but having those stepping stones to really build that confidence and listening and observing, right? There's so many things that, and I think I've learned also from reading what a good leader is, from listening to my other leaders and really seeking out advice and perspectives and growth. And I think that, you know, if there's a style that I adhere to or think, it's a learning leader, right? Like I'm always open to learning. I'm fostering that engagement and learning from others. And there's so much synergy and growth when we learn from each other.
I like the idea of a learning leader. You always think like when you're a leader, you already know everything, but clearly that's not the case at all.
No, and I think that's, you know, being in the inclusive excellence perspective and really talking about cultural awareness and responsiveness and competency, and it's the same thing to that perspective, right? We're always growing. There's always situations where we can do better. So knowing that leadership is not stagnant, it's not a stagnant skill. The same way that our clinical skills are not stagnant, we're always growing. We're lifetime learners. I think when you're a neuropsychologist, you're a lifetime learner. You keep reading, you do research. And I do find myself, you know, reading books and hearing podcasts about leadership and what works and what doesn't. And I consult a lot with my partner as well, and my family. You know, they're always like, "You're so bossy," and I was like, "Well, not at work, just with you guys." I hear more perspectives, so really looking at that.
Really great. And speaking of that, what do you think are some common challenges that students or trainees experience when they are pursuing these leadership positions in national organizations?
You know, feeling overwhelmed of, you know, where do I start, right? Where do I go, and where also, you know, we sometimes, I think we've done a really good job of energizing our student pipeline. So in positions, you know, for student representative, for example, for the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society, when I ran for student representative, I ran without anybody else running, right? And now there were, I think, 6 people running. Right. So it's a true testament to, we really value our students, and now we're pushing, but then to not get discouraged, right? Like, I think that's the part where to not get discouraged if you don't get it the first time, to keep trying to try other organizations. You know, we've had members in boards that sometimes don't win the first time, but then apply again, and then they win a second time, or looking at other opportunities to getting involved, right? Like, okay, you didn't get elected as student representative, but we have the student association and we have members, and we start developing those committee skills at a national level, right? And being heard. I know there's, you always volunteer for conferences, right? So we have, for the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society, I think we had 20 volunteers, students that volunteer to do different aspects and be on committees, and then you can highlight that in your application. So there's always different ways to getting involved, and those opportunities for students are increasing, but also with the awareness, there's more people running for positions. So I think that's the to not get discouraged, and to really continue to pursue it. Mm-hmm. Do you see that in ANST as well? Do you get more students now becoming involved?
Yeah, definitely. Connected to the wealth of opportunities, there's also been an explosion of what people are aware of, and what is accessible now at committees, in committees, both at conferences, and how it's publicized with, you know, social media. So definitely we've seen a lot more of an active student base, and it's very encouraging to see so many people reach out and so many people want to be involved. I think that that's a true testament to, you know, the people that were in previous leadership positions, how they have kind of fired up the base, if you will, of neuropsychology trainees.
Yeah, I think social media has definitely also helped, like getting the word out and making sure that a lot of people know about these positions now, and from the top of these committees, wanting more students involved has been really great to see over the last couple years too.
Yeah.
And so, related to that last question, what resources do you think would be helpful for students and trainees to learn about in order to best prepare themselves for a leadership position in neuropsychology? What are some practical steps that they can do right now, that they can take right now to reaching that eventual goal of having a leadership position?
I think now it's, I think we've touched a little bit on different perspectives, but I think that creating the network, right? Creating and joining organizations, even if it's not at a leadership position, but being on the ANST listserv, right? I learned so much from being on multiple listservs, and the Division 40 has great listservs, and they're all free for everybody to join. And you hear different perspectives, right? There's the early career, there's the women in neuropsychology, there's the general listserv, there's the student one, as well as the ethnic and minority affairs committee one. There's the big international ones, but really looking at the conversation, because that's where opportunities are going to get announced, right? So following, I was very intimidated with Twitter. And I give all the credit to Dr. Monica Rivera and to really encourage, like, you have to sign up, you have to be active. This is where the conversations are going. And, I was recently on the virtual summit and like posting and tagging and like getting followers. And, but that's where a lot of knowledge is being shared. So really becoming active, even if it's just following hashtags and following people and seeing what the conversation is, and then starting to post, but sharing and then also learning from what's being shared. I think another one is if you're, questioning like, what is a good leader? What are leadership styles? What are all these? I think reading and hearing podcasts about that. So I definitely do that. I have a very long commute going down to Houston. So I hear podcasts, and then reading articles, for example, in mentorship. I think that is something, having mentors, find mentors that are not only a research advisor. I have multiple mentors, in different aspects of my career and things that I come to for. So starting to build that network of colleagues, peers, mentors, joining listservs, and then opportunities, right? The NAN Leadership Ambassador Development Program. That is for early career and for fellows. So it's a leadership program where they teach all, you talk to past NAN presidents, as well as really what leadership skills, management skills, and all that. As well, I think the Division 40 has one with the Student Leadership Development Program, right? So if looking also at trainings that you can attend, right? How about for you guys? What's been helpful resources? I know you're in leadership positions as well. So what's been helpful for you?
I think what's been helpful for me is actually, so my advisor is very involved with different committees, so it's been helpful to talk with her. I also had a recent graduate of our program in my lab. That's been helpful to talk with them and see what exactly, like I know what it says for the requirements and responsibilities, but what is it really like to have that? So it's been helpful to speak with other people and my colleagues who've been in these committees.
Yeah.
I think for myself, it's been, overcoming that initial hesitation. So I likewise had a lot of hesitation about joining Twitter. I know that has been something that I've heard from multiple supervisors and colleagues about joining Twitter and being active. And I think, together with social media expanding, there is like some, hesitation, but recognizing that social media is really pushing our platform further. So even though there's hesitation to maybe, do telehealth, but how can that further the field? How can Twitter, Facebook, how can all these access points, how can they further the field? As well as, I think prior to COVID, I think the access to webinars via Zoom or via other platforms was not as common, was not as accessible, and now this is really pushed us to really use this platform, to embrace this platform, and how can we kind of use it to advance the field. So I think using social media, using these platforms, I think is definitely a way that one can get involved in leadership and advocacy roles.
No, I think you bring an interesting perspective of, the Twitter and social media and all within COVID, right? I think we've relied on it so much during this time, but it's also learning about all the events currently on racial equity and racial injustice. And I think it amplifies the need for leaders to be having these conversations within their committees, to being able to take action steps, right? I think staying current with events and how can you grow as leaders. I think I've been in different committee and board meetings since the death of George Floyd and since COVID, and what it means to all our underrepresented minorities that are getting more impacted, as well as, now for Texas, for me, is more numbers, right? Our pandemic is increasing, bringing it as part of the conversation in your board meetings. Like, how are people feeling? I've had webinars where I've met with students to talk about something and really appreciating, asking, how is everybody feeling, right? Like, I think there is emotional intelligence in leadership that needs to be at the forefront right now, and checking in how board, students, and everybody is doing, but also taking action steps. So I've also appreciated being in board meetings where they're like, okay, what are we going to do? What's the action steps? How can we, support Black Lives Matter movement and our other communities of color, and be upfront, be bold, be making changes. And I think that's what leadership right now calls for. And I've been thankful for the leaders that I've heard in different meetings, as well as hearing what I have to say and hearing what other people have to say. So I think it's a time to speak up. It's a time to encourage representation, to really move the field forward. So I think that's our responsibility as leaders as well, to give others a voice.
Thing that we were hoping that you could speak about is, what is one thing that you wish someone would have mentioned to you or would have told you about leadership and taking a leadership responsibility or advocacy role? And how do you think this can be addressed in the future? Or what did you do to kind of overcome this thing that you wish you would have known about prior?
So for me, so I'll share. So I from Guatemala, and didn't want to study in terms of business administration and all that. And I said, oh, I want to be a psychologist. Like, I really don't want to deal with politics and all these things. And the more leadership positions that I get, the more that politics do apply, right? And you have to be that emotional intelligence, good communication, really hearing perspectives. So that's been one where there's been a lot of consultation, because now they're coming, if you're in a leadership position, they'll come to you and say, okay, this is the situation, I'm having issues with this part. So you have to be objective, impartial, really hear everybody's aspects. How are you going to problem solve? I think those are leadership skills that I continue to develop. And every situation is different, right? So there's that flexibility of, learning to identify and read the room. And, so I think there's so much politics involved. And I was like, yep, leadership, this is great, let's do this. And I'm like, nope, there's lots of moving pieces and lots of history that one needs to know. So I think it's taught me to really do a needs assessment, not just of what are things that we can change, what are things that are really working, but also what is the needs assessment of the culture, right? Like coming into a new job recently, I really wanted to know what the culture was. What's all the history, what are all the moving pieces? And there's so much to learn from that. So I think it was not just moving forward as a leader, but really looking at the history of an organization, a history of why things are the way they are, or why are we moving for growth. So I think I've learned that sometimes like a golpes, which means like sort of like by fumbling of like, oh, okay, and continue to grow.
Well, Dr. MacDonald, on behalf of the entire ANST community, we want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to participate in this really important webinar series on professional development and leadership in neuropsychology. We greatly appreciate all of your input and all of your insight from your experiences to your continued involvement in leadership. And behalf of the entire ANST community, we just want to say thank you.
And I want to thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the very thoughtful questions and conversation. I greatly appreciate it. As I said, students and trainees are the future of our organization, and it is our responsibility to foster and engage and continue to strengthen our student pipeline and to have those voices represented in our leadership and committee, clinical work, research, community work. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.